Maya Williams stepped into the courthouse with a quiet air of confidence, her heels clicking softly against the cold marble floor. The bustling crowd seemed to part as she moved through the crowd, her eyes focused ahead. She was used to this kind of attention, but today it felt different. Today, she was here for something that didn't quite sit right. She had made a simple mistake, a minor traffic violation, and yet she was here facing the judgment of the system. She knew all too well the people around her seemed unaware of the layers beneath the surface. The courthouse was busy as usual, people gathered in corners talking nervously or reading over papers. The weight of the day's proceedings hung in the air, but Maya didn't flinch. She had learned long ago how to navigate spaces like this. It wasn't the first time she found herself in a room full of strangers, all assuming they knew her story. Just by looking at her, the judge was already in place. When she entered his courtroom, she had heard of him before. Judge Richard Cooper, a man of stern presence, known for his quick decisions and clear-cut rulings. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew she wouldn't be intimidated. Maya made her way toward the front of the room, her eyes scanning the judge as she walked up to stand before him. She had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times before, keeping her face calm and collected, ready to play the part she needed to play. She wasn't here to fight. It wasn't a case worth fighting for. The ticket was small. The fine was modest. Still, she felt an odd sense of unfairness creep in her chest. When she stood before him, she could tell Judge Cooper sized her up almost immediately. His gaze lingered over her professional attire, her poised demeanor, the way she held herself with purpose and strength, and he made a judgment without even knowing her name or her story or anything about her beyond the surface. She could see it in the way his eyes moved toward the paperwork before him. In a quick and almost dismissive manner, he spoke to her without pause or warmth. The fine was set with little ceremony, and Maya could almost feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. He expected no protest, no challenge, no rebuttal. He expected her to accept it without question. And for a moment, it felt like everything in the room was pushing her to comply. There were no raised voices, no arguments, no grand gestures of defiance, just the sound of her calm breath in the silence of the courtroom, the quiet hum of her own thoughts as she stood there listening to him issue his ruling. It was almost too easy. He had made his decision, and Maya had no intention of making it harder for him. She nodded politely, her voice steady, as she thanked him for his time and turned to leave. As she walked away, there was no triumph in her step, no relief, just the awareness that the encounter was over. She had already moved on, even if he hadn't yet begun to understand the lesson she had quietly learned a long time ago. The courtroom was a space for assumptions and judgments, all too often based on what people looked like, not who they really were. Judge Richard Cooper sat back in his chair after Maya left the courtroom, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the edge of his desk as he glanced at the next case on the docket. It was routine, a typical day for him. As usual, his mind didn't linger too long on the cases unless something truly stood out. But this case didn't demand much of his attention. Maya Williams had been calm, collected, poised, even, but that was no surprise to him. In fact, it was something he had seen time and time again. People like her seemed to carry themselves with a kind of composed demeanor that suggested they didn't belong in the courtrooms of small infractions like this. He made the quick assumption she was a woman who had everything in order, perhaps just someone caught in a minor mistake. The traffic fine wasn't worth much in his eyes, a small blip in her otherwise perfect life, something easily paid off and forgotten, the kind of case that rarely left a lasting impression on anyone except maybe the person writing the fine. Yet for some reason, he couldn't shake the image of her walking out of the courtroom, her face serene and unreadable. There was something about the way she carried herself that seemed to stand out against the backdrop of other defendants who walked through his doors, people who were often visibly nervous or defiant. Perhaps that was what stuck in his mind. The contrast between her and the others. She wasn't like them, yet she was in the same place, the same courtroom, facing the same system. And he had treated her just like anyone else, no better or worse than the hundreds of other minor offenders he had seen over the years. It was the nature of his work. The system moved on, as it always did. People came in, got their sentences, and left with no fuss or drama, and he believed that was justice working as it should. Still, he found himself wondering for a brief moment whether he had made the right call, but only for a moment. Then he pushed the thought away. The case was closed. And nothing was out of the ordinary. Judge Cooper had been doing this long enough to know how things worked. The pattern of his day was predictable, even comforting in its consistency. But as he moved on to his next case, his mind began to wander back to Maya Williams, the woman who didn't seem to belong in this world of small infractions. Her calm was unsettling, almost like she had an understanding of something he didn't, or maybe it was just the fact that for once he wasn't entirely sure what to make of someone, and that feeling made him uncomfortable in a way he wasn't used to. He had seen plenty of people like her in the past, but there was something different about Maya, something that didn't quite fit the image he had formed of people who ended up in his courtroom. He shook his head, refocusing his thoughts back to the case at hand. But somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had missed something about her, something important. Still, he wouldn't dwell on it. After all, Maya Williams was just another name on a docket, a fleeting moment in his day he would forget soon enough, just like all the others. As Maya walked down the steps of the courthouse, her heels clicking steadily against the pavement, a quiet storm began to churn within her. The weight of the decision pressed down on her more than she had anticipated. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the way she had been treated, the way the judge had looked at her as if her worth could be summed up by a few outward appearances. His assumptions, his quick judgment, felt like an insult, and though she had left the courtroom without a word, a sense of injustice gnawed at her from the inside. Maya paused for a moment, standing on the courthouse steps, letting the cool air wash over her. She could feel the eyes of passers-by lingering, but it was different now. She wasn't just another person walking down the street. Today, she had been reduced to a stereotype, to a set of assumptions made by someone who thought he could read her life based on the way she looked. For a brief second, she wondered what the people around her thought. Did they see her as a typical defendant? Or did they see the woman who had spent years building a career from nothing, fighting her way to the top of a corporate law firm? Her thoughts were interrupted by a buzzing in her purse. She reached for her phone, pulling it out to see a message from Tom, a colleague from her firm. The message was simple. How'd it go? Maya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped off the stairs, heading toward the nearby parking lot. She could feel the pulse of frustration beginning to build, but she wasn't about to let it spill out. Not yet. When she reached her car, she unlocked the door and slid inside, letting the quiet of the vehicle surround her for a moment. Only then did she type her response. He gave me the fine, but it wasn't about the fine. It's what happened before that. Maya paused before sending the message, fingers hovering over the screen. She added one last line. We need to talk. Tom knew exactly what she meant. Within minutes, he called her. His voice came through clear, a blend of concern and curiosity. What happened, Maya? Maya's response was simple but loaded. He assumed he didn't see me as a person, just a stereotype, and I can't let that slide. Tom was quiet for a moment. So what do we do? I'm going to fight it, Maya said, her voice firm. Not just the fine, but the assumption. The idea that people like me don't belong in those courtrooms. That just because I look the way I do, I'm supposed to fit into their idea of who should be there. Tom hesitated. You know this could get complicated, right? I don't care, Maya replied, determination setting in. I've fought bigger battles than this. It's time to make some noise. And with that, Maya's quiet resolve shifted into something more powerful. She wasn't just going to let this moment pass quietly. It wasn't about one fine or one judge's assumption. It was about sending a message. A message that people like her, with her background, her ambition, her accomplishments, wouldn't be dismissed or overlooked simply because of how they looked. She put the car in drive and headed toward the law office, her mind already whirring with ideas. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The evening passed quietly, but Maya's mind raced. As soon as she arrived at her law office, she headed straight for the conference room. Her colleagues, used to her calm demeanor, noticed the change in her. There was an unmistakable fire in her eyes, a glint of determination they hadn't seen before. As she sat down at the table, Tom arrived, bringing with him a few more members of their team. Maya didn't waste time with pleasantries. We're going to take this all the way, she said, her voice steady but full of purpose. This isn't just about the fine. It's about something bigger. I've been thinking about how the system works, or rather, how it doesn't work. We need to fight the assumptions, the biases that make people like me invisible in spaces like that courtroom. Tom leaned forward, sensing the gravity of her words. You're not planning on just contesting the fine, are you? Maya shook her head. No, that's not enough. This goes beyond one judge's decision. We need to challenge the way people are seen, especially in the justice system. It's too easy for someone like me, someone who doesn't fit the usual mold of who's supposed to be in those rooms, to get overlooked. And Judge Cooper's behavior was just the tip of the iceberg. Her colleagues exchanged glances. They all knew Maya as a top-tier corporate lawyer, skilled and methodical, but this was something different. This wasn't about climbing a corporate ladder or winning a high-stakes case. This was about sending a message. Maya had always been dedicated to fairness, but this was personal. After a moment of silence, Tom spoke up. What do you need from us? Maya looked around the room, meeting each colleague's eyes. I need research. I need data. I need to know what's out there. How often does this kind of thing happen? How often do people like me get judged before they even speak? We'll take this to the media. We'll build the case, and we'll show the world what happened. This isn't just one person's mistake, it's the system itself. Everyone in the room knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Challenging the biases within the justice system was no small task, but Maya had never backed down from a challenge. As they began brainstorming strategies, Maya felt a sense of resolve growing stronger. The following days were a blur of research, meetings, and phone calls. Maya poured herself into every detail, working late into the night. She contacted civil rights organizations, gathering testimonials and studies on racial bias in the judicial system. She spoke with former colleagues who had experienced similar situations, collecting personal stories that could help illustrate the broader problem. Meanwhile, Tom began reaching out to reporters. They needed the public to see this for what it was, a systemic issue that went beyond one courtroom. The more Maya thought about it, the more she realized this case had the potential to spark a larger conversation. It wasn't just about defending herself. It was about creating change for others who had been unjustly treated because of their appearance, their race, or their background. One evening, after yet another long day of strategizing, Maya stood in front of the window in her office, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled below, but her mind was 1,000 miles away, still replaying the moment in the courtroom when Judge Cooper had made his judgment. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been underestimated or overlooked. And she wasn't going to stop until the system saw them, not just for who they appeared to be, but for who they truly were. The media storm that followed Maya's decision to take action spread like wildfire. At first, it was just a small mention in a local newspaper, an article that caught the attention of a few curious readers. But soon, the story took on a life of its own. Journalists dug deeper into the background of Maya Williams, uncovering her impressive legal career, her advocacy for fairness, and her status as one of the top corporate lawyers in the city. The public's curiosity turned into fascination, and soon the story was everywhere. The headline: White Judge Finds Black Corporate Lawyer, Unaware of Her Legal Expertise, brought attention to a much larger issue. Maya wasn't just another minor defendant. She was a woman who had built her career through years of hard work. And now, in the eyes of the public, she had become a symbol of something bigger. A symbol of the assumptions that people, especially those in positions of power, were quick to make based on race, gender, or appearance. Social media exploded with support. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #SeeInformed started trending. People shared their own stories of bias and discrimination, and it quickly became clear that Maya's experience was far from unique. It wasn't just about the fine or the judge's decision. It was about a system that had long been built on bias, and now people were paying attention. Maya's phone rang nonstop. She had reporters calling her at all hours of the day and night, eager to hear her side of the story. She was careful with her words, always measured, always calm, but underneath it all, there was a simmering anger. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been wrongly judged or overlooked. Her story had struck a chord with people across the country, especially in communities that had long felt marginalized or dismissed. In a carefully arranged interview with a well-known news outlet, Maya explained her perspective. "This case isn't just about one judge," she said, her voice steady and confident. "It's about how easy it is for people to make assumptions about someone based on how they look. We're all guilty of it, to some degree, and the truth is, when those assumptions are made in a courtroom, it can have serious consequences. What happened to me might seem like a small issue, but it's part of a larger pattern of bias that runs through our justice system." Her words resonated with millions. The coverage continued to grow, and with each passing day, Maya's resolve deepened. She wasn't just fighting for a reversal of the fine anymore. She was fighting for something much larger. The system needed to change, and Maya was going to be the one to help lead the charge. The media attention began to put pressure on the courthouse, and soon even Judge Cooper found himself caught in the crossfire. Despite the growing public scrutiny, the judge remained silent. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. His judgment had been quick and, in his mind, justified. But now, with the weight of public opinion turning against him, he started to feel the pressure mounting. His reputation, carefully built over years of service, was suddenly in jeopardy. He hadn't anticipated a challenge of this magnitude, especially not from someone like Maya, who he had dismissed without a second thought. The stage was set for a showdown, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Maya had become more than just a lawyer fighting for a simple ticket. She had become a beacon of resistance against the biases that pervaded the justice system. And this was just the beginning. As the days passed, Maya's case gained more traction. One had started as a small protest against a personal injustice had blossomed into a full-blown campaign for systemic change. The media coverage intensified, and soon other public figures began to weigh in. Activists, lawyers, and even political leaders spoke out in support of Maya, applauding her courage in challenging the biases that many had long ignored. Maya spent every day answering phone calls, meeting with her team, and reviewing the growing body of evidence. She knew this was bigger than just her personal fight. It was a battle for fairness, equality, and accountability. She had made her stand, and now it was time for the justice system to answer for the ways it had overlooked and dismissed people who didn't fit its narrow ideals. Despite the mounting pressure, Judge Cooper remained steadfast in his silence. His colleagues on the bench, many of whom had known him for years, were beginning to question his judgment. They had seen him hand down hundreds of fines, but this case had reached a level of visibility that none of them had anticipated. The whispers within the courthouse grew louder as discussions turned to whether Cooper's actions had been an isolated incident or part of a deeper, more pervasive issue. Maya, however, wasn't interested in waiting for the system to change on its own. She had already begun preparing for the next step. Her legal team had filed an official complaint with the State Judicial Board demanding an investigation into Judge Cooper's conduct. The grounds for the complaint were clear: bias, unfair treatment, and a lack of professional judgment. Maya wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, get away with using their power to make snap judgments about people who didn't fit their mold. The process was slow, but Maya didn't mind. She knew that real change took time. As her legal team gathered more evidence, Maya's resolve only grew stronger. She spoke at public events, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up for themselves. The feedback she received was overwhelmingly positive. People from all walks of life reached out to thank her for speaking out and giving them a voice. Her social media channels were flooded with messages of support, and many shared their own stories of discrimination and bias, both in and outside of the courtroom. But not everyone was supportive. There were those who, even in the face of overwhelming evidence and public outcry, defended the judge's actions. Some dismissed Maya's case as trivial, claiming that it was just a misunderstanding, an isolated incident that didn't warrant the attention it was receiving. Others tried to discredit her by questioning her motivations, suggesting that she was simply trying to make a name for herself or seeking revenge for a minor inconvenience. But Maya wasn't swayed by these attacks. She had learned long ago that in the face of adversity, The best response was to keep moving forward with unwavering determination. One afternoon, as Maya sat in her office reviewing legal documents, she received a call from Tom. His voice was serious, his tone urgent. "Maya, you need to hear this. The Judicial Board is moving forward with an investigation into Judge Cooper. This could get real serious for him." Maya felt a surge of triumph. This was the moment she had been working toward. The judge's actions, once swept under the rug, were now under the microscope. The investigation would ensure that he couldn't just walk away from the controversy. The wheels of justice, slow as they might be, were finally in motion. But even as the legal process began to unfold, Maya knew this wasn't just about Judge Cooper. It was about breaking down the systems of bias that had shaped not only the courtroom but society at large. She had sparked a movement, a call for change that couldn't be ignored. And no matter the outcome of the investigation, Maya was determined to make sure that the conversation she had started would continue long after the cameras were gone. The investigation into Judge Cooper moved forward with surprising speed. Maya's legal team worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence, speaking to witnesses, and filing motions. Public pressure continued to mount, and the once steady confidence of the judge began to waver. The Judicial Board, initially reluctant to intervene in a case that seemed so trivial, now had no choice but to address the growing outcry. Maya didn't shy away from the spotlight. Every step of the process was an opportunity to shine a light on the deep-seated issues within the justice system. She held press conferences, spoke with reporters, and made appearances on national talk shows. Her message was clear. The system was broken, and it was time for those in power to be held accountable for their actions. Judge Cooper, meanwhile, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. For the first time in his career, his decisions were being scrutinized not just by the legal community but by the public. The quiet assumptions he had relied on for years, the ones that had allowed him to operate without challenge, were now under a magnifying glass. He had expected the case to blow over, to be just another routine fine in a system that rarely questioned its own judgments. But it hadn't gone that way. Not by a long shot. The Judicial Board convened to discuss the matter, and soon, Maya was informed that they would be conducting a formal hearing to determine whether Judge Cooper's actions had violated any ethical guidelines. The hearing was set for several weeks later, and as Maya prepared for the next stage of her fight, she knew the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about securing a ruling in her favor. It was about setting a precedent for the future, about ensuring that others wouldn't have to face the same kind of biased judgment she had. Behind the scenes, Maya and her team continued to work, preparing her argument for the hearing. They compiled extensive evidence of racial and gender bias in the legal system, showcasing not just her own experience, but the broader patterns of discrimination that affected countless others. She knew the hearing would be a battle, but she was ready. This was her moment, not just to defend herself, but to help rewrite the narrative for those who had been unfairly treated by the system for too long. In the midst of all this, Maya's personal life had begun to feel the strain. Her phone never stopped ringing, and the constant media attention left little room for anything else. Friends and family offered their support, but even they could see that Maya was becoming consumed by the case. She'd always been driven, but now the weight of what she was doing seemed to press down on her more than ever before. There were days when she wondered if the fight was worth it, when the exhaustion and stress threatened to overwhelm her. But when those moments came, she would think of the people who had reached out to her, the individuals who had shared their own stories of being judged unfairly, the voices that had been silenced for too long. For them, Maya couldn't back down. She couldn't stop. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was filled with an unusual energy. It wasn't just the lawyers and judges in attendance. It was the media, the activists, and even ordinary citizens who had come to witness the proceedings. It felt like more than just a legal battle. It felt like a moment of reckoning, a moment where the justice system was being asked to face its flaws head-on. Maya sat at the table with her team, calm but resolute. She knew the road ahead would be difficult and the outcome uncertain. But no matter what happened in that room, she knew one thing for sure. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or unjustly judged. The courtroom was filled with an air of anticipation as the hearing began. The seats were packed with reporters, legal professionals, and members of the public who had followed Maya's case from the very beginning. There was a quiet murmur of conversation as everyone settled in, aware that this wasn't just any ordinary hearing. It was a historic moment, one that could change the course of justice for many people across the country. Maya sat at the table with her legal team, poised but focused, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The tension in the room was palpable. She had prepared for this moment, reviewed every detail, every piece of evidence, and rehearsed her arguments. But nothing could fully prepare her for the weight of the situation. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for, the chance to stand up not just for herself, but for all those who had been unfairly judged and marginalized. Judge Cooper sat at the front of the room, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. He had once believed that his authority and position would protect him from any scrutiny, but now, facing Maya's relentless pursuit of justice, he seemed unsure. His lawyers sat beside him, speaking in hushed tones as they prepared to present their defense. But it was clear to everyone in the room that this wouldn't be an easy fight for him. The public pressure was immense, and the evidence against him was growing stronger by the day. The hearing began with opening statements. Maya's lawyer spoke first, outlining the details of the case and emphasizing the broader issue of racial and gender bias within the justice system. He cited studies and real-life examples showing how people of color, particularly women, were often subjected to unfair judgments based on their appearance or background. He made it clear that Maya's case wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern that needed to be addressed. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she stood tall and addressed the room. Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable passion in it. "I am not here to attack a single individual," she began, looking directly at Judge Cooper. "I am here because I know that my experience is not unique. I have spent my entire life fighting for fairness and equality, and when I walked into that courtroom, I expected to be treated with respect. Instead, I was judged based on who I am, how I look, and the assumptions that come with that. The truth is, the justice system has failed many people like me, and that is something we cannot ignore any longer." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, all eyes on her. We must ask ourselves, what happens when the system we rely on to deliver justice is tainted by bias? What happens when a person's worth is decided before they even speak? I'm here to ensure that no one else has to face the same prejudice that I did. This is not just about one ticket, one judge. It's about ensuring that every person who walks into a courtroom is seen for who they truly are, not for who others assume them to be. Maya's voice wavered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. The audience in the courtroom was captivated by her words, and even the judge seemed to be paying closer attention. For the first time, the reality of what she was saying seemed to reach him. The hearing went on for hours, with testimony from various witnesses, including legal experts, civil rights activists, and members of Maya's own team. The weight of the evidence mounted. There were no easy answers. Judge Cooper's defense was weak, his attempt to explain his actions framed as a misunderstanding, but the facts spoke for themselves. The scrutiny had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore the deeper issues at play. In the end, the judicial board made their decision. Maya had won. The board ruled that Judge Cooper's actions were indeed biased, and they issued a formal reprimand. More importantly, they pledged to implement new training programs for judges to help them recognize and combat bias in their decision-making. Maya stood in the hallway after the hearing, surrounded by her colleagues and supporters. The weight of the victory began to settle in. It wasn't just about the fine or the judge, it was about changing the conversation, about shining a light on the biases that had been allowed to persist for far too long. As she walked out of the courthouse, she couldn't help but smile. The battle wasn't over. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt that the system was beginning to change, and that change had started with her.